Welcome to the Automotive Hall of Fame. I'm Brian Baker, the Vice President of Education and Principal Historian. Today we are honored to have with us Roger Bailey. Roger Bailey is not a household name, but probably one of the most important men in motorsports over the past 50 years. We'll start with recounting Roger's career. He does it much better than I do, but I'm going to just give you a few facts to bear in mind, and I'll ask Roger to elaborate when we get a second here. But he began his career by being born. What town were you born in, Roger?
Born in Crowland, Lincolnshire, which is about 90 miles north, slightly east of London.
And you mentioned Jim Russell, the great racing school.
Yeah, Jim had a racing school, and my early interpretation of racing was I wanted to be a driver like everybody else. And my grandfather, who was the village blacksmith, he paid for me to go to Jim Russell Racing School in 1958. And one day we were having lunch at the Doric in Attleborough, and Jim said he was looking for a junior mechanic to work on his Formula 2 car with a guy named Pip Preece. So, wow, it's an opportunity. So I went home and I told my granddad what was going on, and he said, well, if you want to go, go. And so a month or two later, I was living in Downham Market, working for Jim Russell. And then...
How old were you at this point?
18. I just turned 18, I think.
Pretty exciting life for an 18-year-old.
Well, my grandfather bought me a motorcycle when I was in my 14, 15. I had a 350 BSA Gold Star, which I became very adept at putting the thing together, taking the pieces, putting it together. Anyway, I'd been at Jim Russell's a short time, and Jim was racing at Le Mans with Bruce at a Cooper Monaco, and had a very, very bad crash and was burnt over a tremendous amount of his body, never raced again. So I was moved. I did a couple of races with a guy named Mike McGee, who was Jim's replacement in the Formula 2, but then they moved me to the Jim Russell Racing School cars on the understanding that I could build cars and drive as much as I wanted. I did all the testing of myself, so I went to Jim Russell Racing School, and one of my early jobs was to drive the truck down to Rye in Sussex to pick up the new Elva Formula Juniors. This would be 59, and I did that for a while, and then Colin Chapman brought out the Lotus 18, and they wanted to go from Elva to Lotus, so the next thing I know, I'm going backwards and forwards to Cheshunt every week to pick up Lotus 18s. And I enjoyed it for a time, but I really enjoyed building engines. And there was no engine building. A guy named Fred Gates did all the engines at Jim. We had 1100 Coventry Climax, a bunch of Elva DKW in the juniors. And I had a cousin in Cambridge that knew Brian Lister. And although Lister had just pulled out of racing, they still had an engine shop. And my cousin Jeffrey got me a job to go to Cambridge to work with a guy named Don Moore, who had done all the Lister engines way back from the MG to the Bristol to the Jaguar, And at that time, in 1960, the Mini had just been announced, the Alex Sisagonis Mini. And
Alex, one of our inductees here at the Hall of Fame.
That's right,
yes.
Alex, yeah. And Don had just done a deal with Marcus Chambers of British Motor Corporation, BMC, to develop and race a Mini. And so no sooner I was at Don Moore's in Cambridge, he introduced me to this guy, John Whitmore, who was a tall, gangly guy. I thought, oh, this guy's a driver. And so I was put on the Mini engine development, which was really interesting. But then they said, we're going to race this thing. This was 1960s. It was mid-60, I guess.
So the Mini, which was introduced in 59, it's a new car.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And now you're going to make the first racing version.
We're going to make the racing versions, and we did a couple there, one for John Whitmore and one for John Ailey. And got through Christmas of 60, and now it's 1961, and they said, Roger, you're going to be driving the car to the racetracks. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, Whitmore's going to race it, but you're going to take it to the races. So I was driving this pea green Mini, a terrible, terrible green. It was like a pea green. And people go, oh, look at that thing. And anyway, TMO 840. So if you ever see it around, TMO 840 was the first racing Mini. And in those days, the British Touring Car Championship, the BRSCC Touring Car Championship, was divided into 4 divisions, up to 1,000, 1,000 to 1600 to 2.5 and above. And you got the same number of points, whether you won overall or won your division. Well, in those days, there wasn't much to race against. I think we had the Fiat Abarths. Well, they may have come later, but there wasn't a lot running. So short story is, John Whitmore, or Sir John, as I find out later, Sir John wins the British Touring Car Championship. And he starts to invite me down to his place of residence. Holy moly, coming from a village blacksmith in Crowland to Orsett Hall was quite an experience. I mean, this was like a big old English country mansion. And then at weekends, this guy named Steve McQueen used to come over and spend weekends. And I didn't know much about movies in those days. I ultimately find out Steve McQueen's a movie star and he's making The Great Escape in Germany. So when they weren't filming at weekends, he'd come and spend the weekend at Orsett Hall with Sir John. And we'd race go-karts around the flower beds and motorcycles. McQueen was a hell of a motorcycle rider. He really was. Anyway, I stayed there and with Don Moore in Cambridge through 61. And then they announced the Cooper Mini. I mean, of course, I knew who Coopers were because of Brabham and McLaren and 59 and 60. Jack was the world champion in a Cooper. And because he'd won the British Touring Car Championship in a regular Mini, John was invited down to Coopers to discuss racing the new Cooper Mini, and which he did. And then they asked him, "Is anybody you want to bring with you?" And he said, "Roger, do you want to go?" Hell yes. So the next thing I know, I'm working in Surbiton for a short while with John Cooper and Charlie Cooper. And it was a very small workshop. It really wasn't much bigger than a large garage today, but that's where all the Coopers were built. It was the first experience, and then one day John called me into the office and introduced me to this guy named Ken Tyrrell. And I didn't know, but in those days, Ken ran everything for Cooper but Formula One. John Cooper ran the Formula One team and Ken ran everything else. And they had a meeting and they were going to run 2 touring car championships. They're going to do the British Touring Car Championship and the European Touring Car Championship with Cooper Minis. And he said, "Well, Roger, Ginger Devlin here, who's been with Cooper a long time, he wants to do the British one. So you're going to go down to Ockham with Ken Tyrrell and you'll be doing the European tour." God, so this is quite the experience. We had a brand new transporter. It was like in the States, you see car carriers with 3 or 4 cars. And we had 3 Cooper Minis on this thing. And but there wasn't, the way the races were spaced, there was a lot of time in between.
3 in a row or 3 ones up stacked?
It was a sloping thing. It was okay. 1 on the bottom, then you dropped it down, and then 2 went up on the top thing. Okay. And then shortly after, in those days, we had Whitmore and
So you're driving the lorry.
I'm driving the lorry and preparing the cars at Ken Tyrrell's. And also had these Formula Junior things, and in those days they had Tony Maggs and Johnny Love, 2 South African and a Rhodesian, were driving the Formula Juniors. And when I'd finished the Minis, I did a little bit more and a little bit more because I'd done the stuff at Russell's. And anyway, the next thing I know, I'm spending about half and half. I did most of the European Touring Car Championship in 62, 3, and a bit in 4. And that's when I first met this Scottish guy, Jackie Stewart.